Hello and welcome to the Nano Film Improv Podcast. I'm Dave Heron. This podcast is about my trials and tribulations associated with improv comedy and doing it, performing it, rehearsing it. So this is really a cathartic outpouring of the things that I've learnt, the things that I'm struggling with, and an opportunity to share with you and hear from you also some of the things that have worked for you, and equally there'll be some things on this podcast that you have tried that don't work for you. It's all very subjective. My experience level is, well, I've had a few years experience doing improv. I've taught a bit of improv. I've performed with a whole range of exciting and talented improvisers and learnt from sets that have gone well and sets that haven't gone well. And this is all part of an evolution for me as well. So you're very welcome in joining me on this podcast. So this week I wanted to talk about the concept of heighten and explore. This is the idea that something is said or done in an improv scene by a character that is slightly out of sync with what one expects the environment of that improv scene. So say, for example, you are two bakers working in a bakery, and then one of you says, all of a sudden, I enjoy the works of Tchaikovsky, or indeed actually more broader than that, I enjoy the works of classical composers. Now, the heightened aspect of that would be to add things in of when it was probably appropriate or indeed inappropriate to listen to classical music. Situations that character would have been in where classical music would have been played and they would have enjoyed it. So really heightening and adding more funny lenses to that. The exploring bit is then understanding why the character enjoys listening to classical music. What made them get into it? What does it remind them of? That's the exploring side. So the heightening is really kind of the vertical. How and more funny or absurd can we make this? And the exploring aspect is then exploring the world around it and why. What other areas have they thought about classical music? What other things have driven them to love classical music? And the reason why I wanted to talk about it today is that over Christmas, I take a bit of an extended break from improv. I've talked about it before around making sure I don't get any improv burnout and just a bit of time away from the scene. I also do the same in August as well, mainly driven by kids' holidays. But when I came back at the start of this year and had a gig recently, I found myself struggling a little bit in rehearsals and struggling a little bit in the show itself. And that's mainly because I was a bit rusty. But I wanted to explore a little bit more of why I was rusty, what things weren't working. So I reflected on some of the scenes that I was in. And I wanted to just highlight 3 examples today that I'd done with We Are Dave, in particular Lewis Hill and Emily Joy. 3 scenes that I did with them where I found myself being a bit stuck, mainly because I was rusty, as I say, but actually understanding why I was stuck and what I could have done to have explored the scene a little bit more and loosened myself up a bit. So the first scene we did, we were 3 characters who together had just opened up a brand new bar. And Emily played a character who was obsessed with being a perfectionist, wanted everything to be right. And we were standing in front of the bar, we were just about to open it. And by the bar, I mean not the actual bar, but I mean the shop front. And I remember thinking, I've got nothing really to add to this. We had suggested that the sign outside had perhaps been a bit askew, and maybe there was a bit of dirt outside the front of the shop. But beyond that, I had nothing else. Now, reflecting upon it afterwards, there are certain things that I could have done. I could have heightened the absurdity of the perfectionist. I could have started off with something small like a little bit of rubbish, but then I could have heightened it even more by sort of saying things like, the inside is dirty, we haven't got the right beer, the glasses are not pint size, the back door has been left open, there's no smoke alarm, and gradually heightening Emily's perfectionist feelings towards the subject by adding those examples in. But I was able to do 2 or 3 of those examples, but I found myself getting stuck because I was thinking, I'm just outside this shop front, this bar front, but I don't have anything more to give. And actually, if I'd explored Emily's character's perfectionist nature, I could have found out why she was a perfectionist. What had driven her to have such a perfectionist type of nature? Was it her upbringing? Was it the school that she went to? Was it books that she read? Where else had she been a perfectionist? And possibly, where else had it gone wrong? So I hadn't been thinking laterally in that example. and hadn't successfully deployed the heighten and explore concept. Another example that we had in the same rehearsal was where the three of us were in a kitchen. We were family members. I was the father, Emily was the mother, and Lewis was the son. And we were trying to fix a washing machine. Now, I was acutely aware that trying to solve a problem in an improv scene isn't a way to have necessarily a successful improv scene itself. So I was very consciously aware that I had to step away from trying to solve a broken washing machine to try and talk about the relationship. And Lewis offered this wonderful, bold offer where he said, well, of course, I'm just back here for the summer holidays. I've been studying philosophy at university. It was a wonderful, bold offer, but I found myself struggling and working out how to apply that to the washing machine. But I didn't need to do that. I just needed to forget about the washing machine and focus on heightening the philosophy angle in this scene. So possibly there could have been other things around the house that he could have applied a philosophical statement to. Possibly Emily and I could have taken philosophical statements like, I think, therefore I am, and applied that to things around the house where Lewis's character hadn't been doing certain chores or something like that. The point is, we could have taken that philosophical point of view and just built up and made more and more absurd things where philosophical statements could have been applied to everyday things around the house. And then, of course, what we could have done as well is then explore why Lewis's character had been involved in philosophy. What had happened to him when he was younger that had made him interested in philosophy? Had he read a book? Had he had a profound road to Damascus moment at some point on a bus? It could have been anything, but laterally thinking as well around exploring and understanding what the reason was why he was interested in philosophy so much, we could have explored as well. And then the final example we had was when we did a set very recently at Hoopla, as We Are Dave. There's a little bit of subtle advertising for you, listeners. And we did our three prov, and in the middle of the three prov, Emily made a remark, a true remark about an item of clothing that I was actually wearing. Not my character, but actually I was wearing. And I should now explain to the listeners, I feel it's my duty to explain, I was wearing a turtleneck. No, not because I'm a fan of Roger Moore from the 1980s, but I had gone out earlier that day and had run totally out of clothing, and therefore the only thing that was left was a turtleneck which was from a character I had done in a film, Humans of the Future. So I threw it on, went out in the day, and then forgot to take it off before I went off for the show. There you are, listeners. There's my reasoning for having a turtleneck. But Emily beautifully called it out in the show. And this goes back to some of the things I've spoken about before around challenging the other improvisers, putting them on the spot a little bit, having that little bit of sense of fun around doing the scene between the improvisers. Well, this got a laugh when she stated, well, you're wearing a turtleneck. The audience loved it, but I had really little comeback on it. And instead, I should have heightened it. I should have heightened the fact that I wore turtlenecks to fancy dinners, but I also wore it to rugby matches, and then explore why this was the case by sort of saying, well, maybe I was into French dressing. Not the vinaigrette, of course, people who are French dressing up. It could have led to me understanding that all people who wear turtlenecks were from the milk tray adverts or had a sort of sense of dangerousness about them. It could have been anything if we'd explored that laterally about the true understanding of why I was wearing a turtleneck and applied that to the scene. So whilst that can seem quite confusing of me going into that, what I'm trying to evidence here is the fact that I found myself getting stuck in scenes simply when somebody said something a little bit different and I wasn't able to start applying that little bit of new information to the scene itself. So those three examples I think are just some nice little examples I've experienced the last week or two where I found myself just a little bit rusty, a little bit stuck in a rut in a scene, and instead of just sort of removing myself from it and thinking, right, what do I do with this new piece of information? I can heighten that. I can make it a little bit more absurd, apply that new piece of information to the surrounding environment, and maybe pull that out and make a little bit of comedy out of that. I'm not exploring the why. What's the deeper reason why that person has said that thing, why they're interested in that sort of thing? Where did that come from? And so I'm hoping now that I can be a bit more mindful of that as I go into scenes. And one of the things we've started working on this week as We Are Dave is just trying to apply heightening and exploring to scenes. So just kind of seeing where that goes. A bit of experimentation. Does it work just simply with one character in the scene and the other two characters working around it? Or can you switch it between two different characters? At the moment, we're just exploring and seeing where that kind of goes. But one thing I have reminded myself is that if stuck in a scene, go back to the why, go back to the relationships and understand why somebody said something. Heighten it, get a bit of comedy out of it if you can do, or new information indeed out of that, and then explore it laterally. Where did it come from and why? Have you ever tried the concept of heighten and explore consciously? Has it worked for you? What sort of things have you found has worked and what sort of things hasn't? I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the subject. Of course, it applies in short form games to a degree as well with game of the scene, but this is something a little bit different in longer form scenes. I'd be really keen to know what your views are and what's worked for you and what hasn't. So thanks very much for listening to the Nano Film Improv podcast, and I'll catch you in the next one.